During my Pipa studies in China, I had 7 wonderful Pipa teachers. Among them, Professor Zhang Qiang, the special guest for this concert, is my most recent and also most influential. The great impact of these teachers on my musical and personal development is probably what made me decide to commit to teaching and performing on the Pipa as a diasporic musician in Australia. Contemporary Pipa music arises from a long and rich musical heritage, yet it depends upon the concept of chuancheng, which is inheritance or transmission. And in the solo Pipa tradition, this is focused upon the lineage. Oral transmission is a traditional way of teaching the instrument, and it still plays an important part in modern ways of teaching. Through it, students often come to imitate the teacher's artistic personality, drawing on understandings gained through systematic and face-to-face tuition, mostly conducted at teachers' home. Teachers are like parents in the traditional way of learning a craft, and some of them are even considered more important than parents. However, the institutionalization of Chinese traditional instrument transmission from the 1950s onwards has had a considerable impact on the Pipa. Players have gradually become less likely to see themselves aligned with or limited by any one specific Pipa teacher. Thus, I have invited both my teacher and some of my Australia-based students who have a passion for Chinese music to share the stage. For my students, this is an incredibly rare and a valuable opportunity to work with such renowned musician as Professor Zhang, and I believe it will be formative in shaping all their future interactions with Chinese music. A further part of our joint sonic voyage is through 3 new compositions by Australian composers, which bring new dimensions to our experience of Pipa music in the Australian context.
The primary inspiration, I think, is the new sound that I'm discovering with the Pipa, because it's not a sound that I'm used to as a composer of electroacoustic music from that particular acoustic instrument. And also, being a violinist, I'm used to certain sounds, but the Pipa for me has a lot different dimension and depth to it. I think it's more trying to discover where the original sound of the instrument came from, perhaps traveling back in time. The instrument evolved over a duration of many centuries, of course, and it evolved also with the introduction of different scales and techniques. I think my intention is to go to the foundational sounds of the instrument. So that's why I call my piece also Hidden Identity, because I'm trying to discover the natural resonances and abstract it from pentatonic scales, for example, that we perhaps normally associate to in the Western world. I think I'm fitting the instrument into my style of composition because I'm applying certain techniques I've explored in the past for live network music performances using the jangu and the erhu. And in this particular case, because I'm using the sound of a traditional instrument again, and also an Asian instrument, I'm trying to apply the same techniques but in a performance setting rather than my experiences in the past with network music. Actually, that's the thing that amazes me the most. Because I originally had this preconception that the pipa is very melodic, I discovered a whole new range of sounds that are possible with that instrument, and so it's extremely difficult to imagine new ways of performing a little bit outside of the conventional range of techniques that already exist for the instrument, well, there's a lot of techniques, but I discovered that maybe through sound and the exploration of sound, there could be an additional set of compositional explorations. The one that resonated with me most is actually the various possibilities of tremolos. So it's not only one type of tremolo, but a 3, 4 finger, 5 finger tremolo that has that brings out different resonances from the instrument. I think that's what fascinated me the most. I'm hoping to create a sonic voyage, trying to discover the shape, the resonance of the instrument, trying to extract the soul of that particular sound and explore it from not only the sound dimension, but the physical aspects of the instrument, developing techniques with the frets, for example, or simply the resonance itself using a microphone to uncover new possibilities for extending and using this instrument perhaps as a sound design tool as well. It would be unusual, actually, this particular case, I think, because I don't have a specific melody or a specific chord structure, harmonic structure. I'm really focusing on the textural elements. I think it would be quite interesting for the students or any listener to say, well, how could I redo those sounds, perhaps without the technology or with the technology, because it might be an extra dimension that was unexplored before. The biggest challenge is not to fall into cliches and, well, cultural cliches for one. So I didn't want to endeavor creating a melody that perhaps may sound somewhat Chinese to me, but might not to someone from China. So I didn't want to cross that particular boundary, and that's why I chose the path of exploring the instrument from a sonic perspective. I think it reflects itself in the main theme of the piece called Hidden Identity, and I'm trying to somehow simulate or incorporate a little bit of my own cultural background, which is Eastern European and, well, French Canadian, but mainly the melodic structure that I've chosen is a sort of a blend or a close blend as possible to the Eastern world. So basically it's East meets West. With a bit of open-mindedness, I think it makes no difference. I think the two can merge quite nicely in new musical structures, rhythmic structures, and the discovery of new blends, new colors, new tones that can make very interesting music for the future. And the only way to discover this is to do experiments like this one, blending acoustic with electronic, trying different different techniques that I would normally do in a conventional context, but here it's clearly a cross-cultural exchange.
I guess in terms of understanding the pipa as an instrument, I guess it is possible to compose from within from a perspective of being immersed in the tactility of the instrument and the cultural tradition from which it comes. Now, this isn't my background, so I guess while I'm always fascinated to learn about musics from other cultures, both from the perspective of trying to discover new sounds and to think about music in different ways, I don't think it would be really authentic of me to just grab some of the superficial gestures associated with the pipa music, at least from my fairly superficial understanding of it. So I've deliberately, to some degree, tried to approach this project from a fairly slightly acultural perspective. So I'm looking at it more as a unique kind of timbre with a unique kind of attack and decay type quality about it. When I mention acultural, and of course nothing is acultural, I guess what I just consciously made a decision to not try and overtly reference a fairly crude understanding of Chinese music. I'm coming at it from a fairly purely sonic perspective, and that is that this is a string instrument with a certain kind of timbre, a certain kind of colour, a certain kind of volume, and who produces notes with a very distinctive kind of pluck string quality. So I guess in approaching this work, therefore, to some degree, I would actually consider it almost open scored to a degree, in the sense that it's not just, a pipa is I guess at the seed of the first edition of this work, Hectic Peppermint, but I do have more broad ideas, I guess, in terms of a family of works that all use instruments that are of a common timbral quality, and importantly, where all of the instruments have a common attack and decay quality. So an instrument that is got a very distinctive, crisp, clean attack, and not too much sustain. I don't have a strong background or understanding of Chinese music, to be very upfront about that. I always have had a fascination in general terms, and this extends to various cultural traditions outside of my dominant sort of Western tradition. But I guess, as I said earlier, I think that, when you're a composer, it's while I am interested in notions of cross-cultural music making, it's a sensitive area, and I don't feel the level of legitimacy or authenticity of pursuing something that might otherwise be of a Chinese flavour, insofar as that I think my contribution would always be, by definition, superficial, because my understandings are rather limited. I've had an ongoing interest recently in, in crude terms of hocketing. Just, for example, my former composition teacher, myself, Louis Andreessen, wrote a work called Hockatus, which I've organised multiple performances of, and it's been deceptively tricky. It's a very simple idea, but it's actually very difficult to execute in performance. So I have this kind of fascination with sound bouncing around, and in a way, I also have an interest in this idea of work rhythms, or anything from like rice pounding rhythms through to sort of chain gang rhythms, where multiple people have executed a task by essentially inventing some kind of interlocking rhythm, so that they don't crash into one another, essentially. And I like this, this idea of interlocking rhythm, insofar as that you take multiple parts, which can be quite interesting in their own right, but when you put them together, they fit together like a puzzle, revealing a new kind of picture or a new type of piece of music when combined. If I guess I'm starting to lean towards a larger scale project, where I'm looking at, I guess, more immersive kind of spatialized ensembles and the movement of sound in space in that regard. So, I mean, the most characteristic feature of Hectic Peppermint is that the two pippers are on either side of an audience, or as widely spread as possible, and that so I guess the effect of the hocketing is exaggerated as much as can be. Well, the tricky thing I think with this piece is exactly that it's not performed so much like a duet, but more like each Pipa player interacting with their with a click track and their score, so that I guess they will rhythmically entrain to a click track more so than the opposite performer, if that makes sense. And at least this is the kind of thing where kind of testing in a piece like this from my perspective. So I think it's in some ways it's sort of anti-ensemble in a way. You know, each player is rather engaging with a piece of fixed media in that regard, and so there's no flexibility in the way that they play. They have to engage with a machine-driven click track. I think is the main reference point that you will use for that sense of rhythm. But it's only really from the audience perspective that how these rhythms interrelate and bounce off one another. That's something that perhaps neither of the Pipa players will ever truly enjoy in the same way that the audience who are positioned in the middle of the two players will. The piece uses the harmonics on the Pipa, and I've restricted myself entirely to the open string and the first three harmonics of each string. So really there are only 16 notes in this piece. It's not entirely true. There are some stopped notes for variation, and they always coincide with an intrusion from an electronic music track. However, I've restricted myself to a very limited palette of pitches and notes, mainly because the primary sort of focus in the work is more on that rhythmic quality. I imagine the piece will sound like a rapid fire. Ping pong is a form of sonic ping pong. Is actually a very good way of describing it as the characteristic of the work. But obviously, I've also requested that one of the pipas be tuned a quarter tone below the other. So this kind of echoing quality will also does have a pitch variation as well. So it always, for one instrument, will always sound slightly out from the other. This is partly to accentuate or augment their kind of separation, but also perhaps playing with this sense of distance or other notions of creating a more sort of interesting palette of pitches overall. I guess first and foremost, notation is part of what I'm playing with at the moment, both from the perspective of what is the best way to capture some of these spatialized ensemble ideas. Am I best to use conventional notation with a conductor? Am I best to use some sort of video-based notation? Am I best to use some kind of audio cues? As you are aware, I've actually tried to express this piece in multiple kinds of ways. I think the one that you are choosing to use is, for me, it's more like a guitar tablature notation. That's just something that's within my field of experience, and I know that is potentially problematic for some Pipa players, because although I think of the guitar frets as from 0 up to 12 and beyond is just fret numbers, I understand that the lower on the Pipa, that you have a different vocabulary for depending where on the instrument you're playing, on the lower neck of the instrument or further up onto the body of the instrument. So it's a different language, but I was keen to use tablature, I guess, as opposed to pitched conventional Western notation, partly just because of the physicality of it. So I guess the quality of tablature to me is one that it denotes physical actions, not sounding results. And I guess a tab notation for me is kind of raw and open. It just says, put your finger here at this time, make a note. It also for me makes it more flexible. Like I do imagine that this work could work with other plucked string instruments. So I guess it also ties in with in a way that's talking about the physicality of playing an instrument without necessarily being prescriptive about the sounding results. You'll notice that I did also prepare or start to prepare a couple of different types of video notations as well for this piece, ranging from something that was more, I guess, just a more animated version of the tablature notation, through to something that was more like the kind of things that children, or not just children, but adults might see in computer gaming, such as Guitar Hero or Rocksmith, where information flies at them down some kind of highway and they have to respond to that. But ultimately, in terms of coordination and synchronicity, I think the main sort of rhythmic entrainment, if you will, the reference will be actually the click track, and I guess like any performance, the visual score, whatever it is ultimately just more of a memory aid to know what's about to come. I'm absolutely flattered to be given the opportunity, and I can't wait to work with the performers in this space.
So, Broken Hill Dreaming was a piece that I wrote in 2019. It's composed for Pipa and bass guitar, electric bass guitar. So, I played the electric bass guitar in the performance with Liu Lu. Broken Hill Dreaming tells a story about basically settlers in Broken Hill, which used to be the third largest city in our state, New South Wales, in Australia. It was originally settled by Afghans, and then Chinese people came to Broken Hill during the 19th century as part of the gold rush and as part of the mining boom out there. So it tells a tale of a sort of cross-cultural socialization between Chinese Australians and Caucasian Australians. Broken Hill Dreaming was performed at the Verbruggen Hall here at the Con in 2019. and yeah, I was really proud of the work because it was the first, as far as I'm aware, piece that incorporates electric bass guitar and pipa together. The instruments work really well with impertinence to their harmonics, particularly because the bass guitar has a lot of harmonics because the strings are so large and the bass is so long that you can separate the different frequencies at various different positions on the fretboard many times. And not so much with the pipa, but it's still quite effective as well too. So those sort of idiomatic features is what I used to make the instruments sound sort of similar together, even though they're very different.
没有设想，但是我很乐意听到这个消息，我很高兴，因为这是也对我来说是一个新的一个尝试。首先我是从来没有来过澳大利亚，第二呢也没有和澳大利亚的作曲家进行过这个音乐上的创作活动合作等等。第三呢，其实你毕业了这么多年之后，我们也很久没有见面了，我觉得咱们俩好像还没有一块弹过琴，好像没有这个机会，所以我就觉得这个事情非常好，非常好。当然，至于这个作品是什么样子的，我是一点都不知道，也没有设想它应该是什么样的。因为作曲对我来说，作曲家他想写什么是他自己的事情，我们要完成他的一些创作的理念，他的一个音乐构思，这是在合作当中需要完成的一件事情，共同去创作。实际上，你发给我的邮件我很早收到，但是我并没有把它打开去练习，因为你也知道，咱们在交流过程当中，因为这段时间学校的事情非常非常的多，包括家里出了一些事情，对，所以会有一些耽搁。之所以后来就是让你去改一下谱子，也就是因为我对这样的记谱形式并不是很习惯。如果有很充足的时间，我去适应这样的一个读谱，这样的一个记谱办法，我要慢慢去适应啊，我熟悉它了，其实完全也可以按照现在这个谱来练的，因为 作为一个乐器演奏法来说，它的记谱，它的在手上的一个反应，它的声音的呈现，它是一个多少年形成的一种习惯，对吧？所以当一个新的一种记谱法摆在你面前呢，确实有点无从下手，是这样，有这样的感觉，对。当然，肯定是这样的，因为我再回到这个乐谱的这个话题，就是因为琵琶的演奏，甚至包括中国乐器的演奏，一般是简谱入手，然后慢慢走到所谓的正规化了，他要到学校以后，他要适应不同的这个创作乐曲，比如说合奏，比如说协奏曲啊等等，于是他一定要去看五线谱。所以对我们来说，对学生来说，就是五线谱和简谱是我们常用的谱子。当然，中国以前有公车谱，对吧？琵琶有公车谱的，但因为历史的原因，它早已经被淘汰了。现在不用了，因为它的实在是记的这个信息量，按照现在我们学习来看啊，它不够直观，对吧？在去年还是前年的时候，应这个孔子学院的要求，我们为了普及中国音乐，走向国际，走向海外，也曾经编写过琵琶的教材。当时就是有一个问题，因为在西方来看，琵琶它不分品和相，它只是按照音柱1、2、3、4、5、6、7、8、9去排的。所以当时摆在我们面前就是这样一个问题。谭论剑教授跟我商量半天，他说我们这个教材既然是面对海外市场、海外的洋人学生，就西方的学生，那么是否可以考虑采用西方的一种读谱习惯？我们不按照什么品呀、相啊这样的概念，就叫音柱，然后从一开始，而不是我们现在是6个相，然后品应该是第7个音柱了，但是我们是品是第1个，这样就在西方他们在读谱的时候产生了困难，就像我现在读这个谱子一样，因为是你的受的这个整体的这个音乐的环境的教育不同，对吧？是习惯不同，所以当时就把这个谱子就改成按照音柱排列，1、2、3、4、5、6、7、8，就是这么排列下去。当时出教材就是这样考虑，这也就是说，中国音乐未来要走向国际，走向更远，这是必须要考虑的问题。怎么样能够有一种国际的通用的一种音乐的语言读谱的一种办法，来更快的让西方人，如果他喜欢中国音乐的话，能尽快的去上手，去弹出美妙的声音。
Thoughts about with this particular piece, would there been some way to make this a bit easier to bring about, or is he confident that the project that you guys will be able to execute the piece anyway?
首先这个写法很有意思，看上去很简单，但是奏起来其实一点都不简单，不太容易，因为它这个节奏型非常机械，机械就是让人做起来反而觉得很，比如说它是用3连音来写的，看上去很简单，但奏起来它可能它的变化会很多，而且它会有不同的节奏性的变化，这是在技艺上，在演奏的技艺上，我觉得我首先是产生了一个障碍之一，就是你没办法去记住，因为中国人习惯了一个旋律的一个记忆，对吧？这个音走向那个音怎么去连接，这个记忆是非常容易的。然后通过这样的记忆，我在手上可以直接发出声音来。但是这个东西我每次看着我都觉得都是新的，每次在跳动的时候我都很紧张，有些这种紧张。当然这个随着时间的延伸，练习的时间延伸，你会慢慢去适应这个东西，这是一定的。可是目前的问题就是，我们好像没有太多的时间去怎么说更能把这个作品做的就是非常非常准确，严丝合缝的去准确。我现在稍微有点担心，是这样的。我上个世纪80年代还做学生的时候，那个时候中国的国门打开了，很多新的一种思潮、思想、理念进入中国， 其中也包括音乐。那时候像谭盾啊、曲晓松啊、郭文景啊等等那一大批的，目前在世界上非常有名的著名的作曲家，他们好像还是学生们，对吧？有的是大学生，有的是研究生，有的已经好像出国了，写了大量的，对于我们来说冲击力非常大的，因为那种作品，因为对我们来说，我们是受的所谓传统音乐教育更多一些，民间呀、传统啊、琵琶的13套啊，突然接受了一种新的一种音乐理念，新的一种奏法，新的手法，新的音响，包括噪音，啊这样的新的音响，包括新的不同的组合出现之后，对我们来说真是很又好奇又有时候也是好像到底怎么去理解它，怎么去处理这样的音乐。我觉得音乐的往前走，音乐的进步，恰恰可能就是这一个阶段一个阶段这么的不停的往前滚。像还是说的这个谱子，我觉得对我来说，我是希望也是希望我的学生，希望所有的演奏家，能不能跳出所谓中国的这样的一个演奏习惯、演奏模式，接受更多的西方。只有这样，你的演奏家这个视野不停的去打开，不停的新鲜的血液进来，不停的新鲜的一种概念被你接受。我觉得这样我们走出去可能才会更加自信，因为音乐是多种多样的。这个作曲家，全球的那么多作曲家，他们的奇思异想，其实对我们来说都是一个很好的一个刺激和挑战。这也是音乐进步，大家共同进步的一个动力，是吧？当然，谈这个作品呢，也同时我这2天也在想另外一个问题，就是在这样的东西，怎么如何去体会它的情感，如何把它诠释得更完美一些，如何让它就是真是通过你的音乐来呈现给大家，这是一个问题。第二个问题就是说，恐怕牵涉到中国音乐走向未来，走向更广泛的一个领域，那就是这样的作品，如果这样去演奏出去，那人家会觉得这是琵琶的声音吗？如果不是琵琶，用吉他弹可不可以？如果用钢琴弹行不行？用弦乐行不行？那如果其他乐器都可以弹的话，那还要琵琶干什么？这就引申出另外一个问题，就是中国琵琶它自身的魅力到底是什么？可能比这个作品这个意义可能会更加的重大了，因为中国是要讲究所谓的韵味、味道啊，中国的地域性、中国风格。这个不仅仅是一个五声音乐的一个排列，不仅仅是一句话能说得很好，但是说的是不是那个腔调，这很重要。
Thank you.